Some people don't ask for help because they are strong. Others don't ask because they were never allowed to need it. From the outside, they look composed, independent, self-sufficient. They handle pressure alone. They solve problems in silence. They disappear when things get heavy and return once everything is under control. But inside, something more dangerous is happening. Because never asking for help is not always confidence. Sometimes it is a psychological trap so deep that the person doesn't even realize they are inside it. This trap doesn't begin in adulthood. It begins much earlier, when needing someone became unsafe, when relying on others led to disappointment, punishment, or shame, when vulnerability was quietly registered by the mind as a liability. So the psyche adapted. It learned a rule. If I need nothing, no one can abandon me. If I ask for nothing, no one can control me. If I carry everything alone, I will survive. And at first, this works. The person becomes capable, reliable, resilient. They become the one others lean on, never the one who leans back. They gain control, discipline, and a powerful sense of self-reliance. But over time, something fractures. Because the human mind was never designed to survive without mirrors, without reflection, without shared emotional load. And when help is refused long enough, the psyche begins to close in on itself. Strength hardens into rigidity. Independence becomes isolation. Control becomes emotional starvation. Carl Jung warned about this exact pattern. He believed that what we refuse to acknowledge doesn't disappear. It sinks into the shadow, where it gains power over us. And the shadow of the person who never asks for help is not weakness. It is exhaustion, unexpressed grief, unprocessed anger, and a growing distance from their own humanity. This video is not about shaming independence. It's about understanding the hidden psychological cost of carrying everything alone, and why the mind chooses this path even when it hurts. If you've ever told yourself, "I've got it," while silently drowning, this is for you. If this resonates with you even a little, subscribe, not for motivation, but for understanding, and stay with me. Because what comes next explains why the mind clings to isolation, and how this pattern quietly shapes your relationships, your nervous system, and your sense of self. The decision to never ask for help rarely feels like a decision. It feels like a realization, a quiet conclusion reached after enough evidence accumulates. The mind does not announce it. It simply adjusts. Somewhere in early experience, a pattern forms. When you reach outward, nothing comes back. Or worse, what comes back hurts. So the psyche learns efficiency. It learns withdrawal. It learns that dependence carries risk, and self-sufficiency feels safer. This is not pride at first. It is protection. For many people, this pattern begins in childhood. Not always through obvious neglect or cruelty, but through inconsistency. Support that appears sometimes and disappears when needed most teaches a subtle lesson. Care that is conditional teaches another. The child does not think in words, but the nervous system records everything. The body remembers disappointment before the mind can name it. Over time, the child stops reaching. Not because they no longer need help, but because needing feels dangerous. Carl Jung believed the psyche is adaptive above all else. It will sacrifice comfort to preserve survival. When asking for help threatens safety, the psyche replaces vulnerability with control. The child becomes capable early, responsible early, emotionally contained early. This looks like maturity. but it is something else entirely. It is premature self-reliance, forged not from strength, but from necessity. As the years pass, this adaptation is rewarded. Teachers praise independence. Employers admire reliability. Friends rely on the person who never needs anything. Society reinforces the pattern without understanding its origin. The individual internalizes a new identity, the one who handles everything alone. An identity is powerful. Once adopted, it resists examination. But what is rarely discussed is the emotional cost of this role. The nervous system remains in a state of quiet vigilance. If no one is coming to help, you must always be prepared. Rest becomes difficult. Trust becomes selective. Vulnerability feels like exposure. Even moments of closeness carry tension, because dependence threatens the structure holding everything together. Jung warned that what is repressed does not vanish. It moves underground. The unexpressed need for support becomes part of the shadow. A person may consciously believe they do not need help, but unconsciously they ache for it. This split creates inner friction. The outer personality appears strong, while the inner world grows increasingly isolated. This is why people who never ask for help often experience sudden burnout. The collapse seems irrational from the outside. They were coping. They were functioning. But coping is not nourishment. Functioning is not healing. The psyche can endure isolation for long periods, but it cannot thrive there indefinitely. Another consequence emerges slowly: resentment. When you carry everything alone, you begin to notice who does not. You watch others receive care effortlessly. You hear encouragement offered freely, and a quiet bitterness forms, often directed inward. You tell yourself you should not need what others receive. You harden further, mistaking emotional numbness for strength. Relationships become complicated. Accepting help feels like debt. Receiving care feels unearned. The individual may give generously, but struggle to receive without discomfort. This creates imbalance. Over time, distance grows. Others feel shut out without understanding why. The person becomes admired, but not known. Jung described this as identification with the persona. The persona is the mask we wear to survive socially. When the persona of self-sufficiency becomes rigid, it blocks the expression of authentic need. The individual becomes trapped inside their own competence. They cannot rest without guilt. They cannot lean without shame. At a deeper level, refusing help maintains control. If no one is needed, no one can disappoint. If no one is relied upon, no one can abandon you. This illusion of control feels calming, but it comes at the cost of connection. The psyche trades intimacy for predictability. Safety replaces warmth. Yet the paradox remains. Humans are wired for interdependence. Mirror neurons, emotional regulation, and identity formation all require relationship. When support is denied long enough, the psyche begins to fragment, not dramatically, but quietly. Motivation fades. Meaning thins. Life becomes functional rather than alive. This is not weakness. It is signal. The mind is communicating a truth the identity refuses to hear. Strength without support is not infinite. Independence without reflection becomes isolation. The war is not against others. It is against the self that still needs what it was taught to reject. Understanding this origin is the first fracture in the trap, not to shame self-reliance, but to see it clearly. Because what once protected you may now be the very thing exhausting you. And until this is acknowledged, the cycle will repeat silently, efficiently, and alone. At some point, the strategy that once kept you safe begins to close in around you. The mind does not announce this shift. There is no clear breaking moment. Instead, strength quietly hardens. What was once flexibility becomes rigidity. What was once independence becomes an unspoken rule. I must handle everything myself. And rules, once internalized, are rarely questioned. The person who never asks for help begins to live in a narrowed psychological space. Options that involve dependence are unconsciously eliminated. Reaching out feels foreign. Explaining feels unnecessary. Trusting feels inefficient. The psyche equates self-sufficiency with survival, so anything that threatens it triggers resistance. Even kindness can feel intrusive. Even support can feel destabilizing. Jung described this phenomenon as over-identification with a function of the psyche. In this case, the function is control. Control over emotions. Control over outcomes. Control over perception. The individual becomes highly capable, but internally tense. They are always holding something together, always monitoring themselves, always managing impressions. Rest feels unsafe because vigilance has become identity. This internal posture shapes how stress is processed. Instead of being shared, stress accumulates. Instead of being expressed, emotion is compartmentalized. The body holds what the mind refuses to speak. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, persistent fatigue. These are not random symptoms. They are the physiological cost of carrying everything alone. Over time, emotional awareness dulls. The person becomes skilled at solving problems, but disconnected from how they feel while doing so. This is not emotional intelligence. It is emotional suppression, disguised as efficiency. Jung warned that suppression creates a psychic pressure that eventually demands release, often in distorted forms. This release may appear as sudden anger, unexplained sadness, or complete withdrawal. It may show up as cynicism, numbness, or a sense that life feels flat. The individual may tell themselves they are simply tired or unmotivated. But beneath this surface explanation lies a deeper truth. A psyche is starving for shared meaning. Relationships suffer quietly. The person may be present, but inaccessible. Others sense the distance, but cannot name it. Attempts to help are met with deflection. Offers of support are minimized. Conversations stay practical, controlled, surface level. Intimacy requires mutual dependence, and dependence feels like danger. This creates a paradox. The individual longs for connection, but avoids the very behaviors that create it. They may feel unseen while simultaneously refusing to be known. This contradiction generates loneliness that feels self-inflicted but impossible to escape. Jung believed that when one part of the psyche dominates, the neglected parts become shadow. In this case, the shadow contains need, vulnerability, grief, and longing. These elements do not disappear. They wait. They influence behavior indirectly. The person may overwork, overthink, or overfunction to avoid feeling them. Another cost emerges, meaning erosion. When life becomes about endurance rather than experience, joy feels inefficient. Pleasure feels unnecessary. The individual may succeed externally while feeling internally hollow. Achievements land without satisfaction. Progress feels mechanical. The psyche asks a question the identity avoids. What is all this effort for? Because asking for help is equated with weakness, The individual also struggles to ask for rest. They push past limits quietly. They pride themselves on endurance. But endurance without recovery leads to depletion. Jung emphasized that the psyche, like the body, requires rhythm, expansion and contraction, effort and surrender. Without this balance, breakdown is inevitable. The most dangerous aspect of this trap is how invisible it is. From the outside, the person looks strong, capable, composed, even enviable. From the inside, they feel increasingly alone with their burdens. They do not complain because complaining feels indulgent. They do not reach out because reaching feels risky. Eventually, the cage becomes self-reinforcing. The longer one survives alone, the harder it becomes to imagine another way. Help feels unfamiliar. Dependence feels humiliating. The identity is built around not needing anyone. To question this would require dismantling the very structure that has kept everything together. But Jung argued that growth demands confrontation with the shadow. The traits we most avoid often contain what we most need. In this case, vulnerability is not the enemy of strength. It is its missing counterpart. Without it, strength turns inward and consumes itself. This chapter is not an argument against independence. It is a warning against imbalance. Self-reliance without connection becomes a psychological prison. Control without softness becomes exhaustion. Strength without support eventually collapses under its own weight. Recognizing this cage does not require immediate change. It requires awareness. Awareness loosens what force cannot. The moment you see the pattern, it begins to shift. Not dramatically, but subtly. The mind starts to consider possibilities it once rejected. And in that consideration, the trap begins to open. There is a moment in every self-reliant life when the silence grows louder than the noise. Not an external silence, but an internal one. A space where emotions should echo, but do not. This is the shadow at work. The part of the psyche that learned early it was safer to need nothing now speaks through absence, through numbness, through a quiet, persistent sense of disconnection that no amount of discipline can erase. Jung described the shadow as everything we deny, disown, or disapprove of within ourselves. For the person who never asks for help, the shadow is filled with unmet needs, dependency, longing, exhaustion, grief. These qualities were not eliminated, they were buried. And buried things do not die, they wait. The shadow does not announce itself directly. It leaks. It shows up in irritation when others appear weak, in impatience with emotional expression, in discomfort when someone offers care without being asked. The conscious mind may label these reactions as preferences or personality traits, but they are defenses, signals of something unintegrated pressing for acknowledgement. This is why people who never ask for help often struggle with intimacy. Intimacy requires exposure. It requires allowing another person to witness your limits. But limits threaten the internal narrative of self-sufficiency. So closeness is kept just shallow enough to avoid risk. Relationships feel safe but unsatisfying, stable but distant. The shadow also expresses itself through overgiving. Many self-reliant individuals are generous to a fault. They offer help quickly. They anticipate needs. They become indispensable. On the surface, this looks altruistic. Psychologically, it maintains control. If you are always the helper, you never have to be the one who needs. Jung warned that what we refuse to live consciously will be lived unconsciously. The person who refuses to ask for help may unconsciously seek situations where they are overwhelmed, unappreciated, or taken for granted. These situations confirm the belief that reliance is dangerous, reinforcing the original adaptation. Over time, the psyche begins to protest. Dreams become intense or disturbing. Fantasies of escape appear. There may be sudden urges to withdraw completely from others. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals of imbalance. The psyche is demanding integration. Integration does not mean abandoning strength. It means expanding it. Jungian integration involves bringing shadow elements into conscious awareness without judgment. In this case, it means recognizing need as human, not shameful. It means understanding that asking for help is not regression, but regulation. Neuroscience supports this insight. Human nervous systems co-regulate. We calm through connection. We process stress through shared experience. When help is refused, the nervous system remains in a chronic state of self-management. This is exhausting. Over time, it erodes resilience rather than building it. The fear underlying refusal of help is rarely about others. It is about loss of control, about being seen in moments of weakness, about confirming an old belief that needing leads to disappointment. These fears are not irrational. They are learned. And what is learned can be unlearned. Jung believed individuation requires moving beyond the persona into a more whole self. The persona of this self-sufficient individual is socially admired, but psychologically incomplete. True strength includes the capacity to receive, to rest, to be supported without self-erasure. This does not require public vulnerability or dramatic confession. Integration happens quietly. It begins with internal permission, allowing yourself to admit fatigue without immediately fixing it, allowing yourself to feel longing without dismissing it, allowing yourself to consider asking, even if you do not yet act. When the shadow is acknowledged, it loses its grip. The need that once controlled behavior from beneath the surface becomes part of conscious choice. The individual can decide when to be independent and when to lean. Flexibility replaces rigidity. Strength becomes adaptive rather than defensive. This shift alters relationships. Boundaries soften without disappearing. Trust grows slowly, realistically. The individual remains capable, but no longer alone with everything. Support becomes an option rather than a threat. Connection becomes a resource rather than a risk. Most importantly, the internal war quiets. The psyche no longer needs to fight itself to maintain an identity. Energy once spent on suppression becomes available for creativity, meaning, and presence. Life feels less like endurance and more like participation. The shadow does not disappear when integrated. It transforms. Need becomes discernment. Vulnerability becomes honesty. Asking becomes choice. The trap was never self-reliance itself. The trap was believing it was the only way to survive. When this belief loosens, something profound happens. The individual does not become weaker. They become whole. And wholeness is a deeper form of power than independence alone could ever provide. There comes a moment, often unnoticed by others, when the person who has always carried everything alone begins to feel the weight differently. Not heavier, but clearer. The load is the same, yet something inside quietly asks a question it has avoided for years. Why am I still holding this by myself? This is not a moment of collapse. It is a moment of awakening. By now, the psyche understands what the mind resisted. Strength was never the problem. Isolation was. The refusal to ask for help was never about pride alone. It was about protection, about survival, about an early lesson learned when support was unreliable, conditional, or absent. The nervous system adapted by becoming its own shelter. Jung believed that every adaptation has a cost. What saves us at one stage of life can imprison us at another. The individual who learned to rely only on themselves survived. They became competent, disciplined, resilient. But survival strategies are not meant to become permanent identities. True psychological maturity begins when we outgrow what once kept us alive. At this stage, something subtle changes. The person does not suddenly reach out to everyone. They do not announce vulnerability. They do not abandon self-reliance. Instead, they develop discernment. They learn the difference between dependence and interdependence, between collapse and connection. Asking for help is no longer seen as surrender. It becomes strategy, wisdom, self-respect. Jung wrote that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off parts of the self, but by including them. The individual who integrates their need for support does not lose strength. They reclaim energy previously spent on suppression. The psyche relaxes. The body exhales. The internal tension that once felt normal finally releases. This is where strength transforms. It no longer needs to prove itself through endurance. It no longer defines itself by how much pain can be carried silently. It becomes quieter, deeper, more stable. The person begins to rest without guilt, to pause without panic, to receive without calculating the cost. They still give. They still stand alone when needed, but they no longer confuse solitude with superiority. Relationships change. Not dramatically, but honestly. The individual allows themselves to be known in small, controlled ways. They test safety instead of assuming danger. Trust is no longer all or nothing. It becomes gradual, earned, flexible. This shift does not make life easier in a shallow sense. It makes life more real. Emotions return with clarity. Joy feels sharper. Sadness feels cleaner. The numbness fades, replaced by presence. The person feels alive not because life is perfect, but because it is shared. One of the deepest fears behind never asking for help is the fear of being a burden. This belief dissolves slowly. The individual realizes that connection is not a transaction. Mutual support is not weakness. It is how humans regulate, grow, and endure together. Jung emphasized that individuation is not isolation. It is integration. Becoming oneself does not require rejecting others. It requires knowing where you end and where they begin. Healthy strength includes boundaries and bridges. The psychological trap is now visible for what it always was. A closed loop of self-protection that no longer serves growth. Escaping it does not mean becoming dependent. It means becoming adaptable. Adaptability is the highest form of strength. The individual who once refused help now understands choice. They can stand alone when necessary, and they can lean when it is wise. Neither defines them. Both are tools. This balance creates a quiet confidence. Not loud, not performative. A confidence that does not need to be seen to exist. A confidence rooted in self-knowledge rather than survival reflexes. Life begins to feel less like a test and more like a process. Less like a burden and more like a shared experience. The person no longer measures worth by how much they can endure alone. They measure it by how honestly they can live. The war inside ends not with victory, but with reconciliation. The strong self and the needing self stop fighting for control. They become allies. Together, they form something more resilient than either alone. This is what Jung meant by wholeness, not perfection, not invulnerability, but balance. The ability to hold strength and softness without contradiction. The person who never asked for help does not become someone else. They become more themselves, freed from the rigid identity that once defined them, open to a wider range of human experience. And in this openness, something unexpected happens. Life becomes lighter, not because the world is easier, but because the burden is no longer carried in silence. This is not the end of strength. It is the beginning of strength that can finally rest. If this resonated, sit with it for a moment. You don't need to react. You don't need to explain. Just notice what stayed with you. And if you want to explore this inner territory more deeply, stay close to this space.